There've been some, maybe just by way of wrapping up, I'll tell a little story about how there was this odd convergence. When I picked up The Beginning of Infinity and began reading it after having heard David Deutsch in an interview by Sam Harris and being very impressed with what he had to say, I was delighted, and I think it was about the third chapter, to read him citing a man by the name of Jacob Bronowski, who had, he was a public intellectual. He was most famous for a BBC production called The Ascent of Man. As a very young kid, I was maybe 14 when my grandmother put in my hands a copy of the book that was based upon this iconic series, or the BBC production. And I loved that book. I read it from cover to cover, time and time again. I gazed, there was wonderful illustrations, and looked at them and understood their meaning. And it was probably my first early strong intellectual influence. And there it is on suddenly, and I've loved listening to this guy. And in chapter 3, he begins citing Bronowski as a huge influence. And this is the first time I'd read anybody refer to Bronowski as an influence. And I was obviously, quite charmed by that. Yeah. And then, of course, another person, Popper, who we've been speaking about, that was an early influence for me, also appears in this book and starts becoming more and more important. And you realize that this guy's Deutsch is doing this extension of the Popper thing. So there was this kind of convergence. Now, another person who I'd been an admirer of for many years is a lesser-known physicist called Leo Szilard, who was the guy who he discovered the atomic explosion process. So it was the technology behind the development of the nuclear bomb. Brilliant Hungarian physicist. But I had come across him also at quite a young age and been very impressed by his moral reasoning. And in particular by one little letter that he wrote, never translated out of German, only it was written in his second language, which was German. And I loved this letter. It contained a list of principles for ways of important principles in life, kind of thing. And I'd been an admirer for many years, and I mentioned this to somebody who was doing helping me with some research, and who went scratching around to discover the history of this letter and where it came from and so on. And she produced for me a letter by Szilard's wife, responding to a friend who'd asked for an English translation, and said, look, Leo was very much against translating. He thought it would lose something if it was taken out of the original German. But one of his friends made an effort at translating it into English, and he said that was a very good translation, and she attached that translation to the letter. And I was delighted to see this English translation, and as I read this handwritten document, I got to the bottom and I saw the name, and I thought, wait a second. And it was Jacob Bronowski.
Sure.
So it's sort of this